could be argued that it's not in the best interests of the station, which is what a committee is trying to do. So again, that's an issue to be considered. I'm also told, we can't do commercial activities because that's profit making, but there's lots of things that I see stations doing. Certainly you can do commercial activities that generate a profit that you then use that money to put back into the job that your community radio station does that's specified in your constitution. And I've seen stations around the countries that are running cafes, for example. Not all the time, but there's certainly one example that runs a cafe every Saturday morning, sells coffee, generates funds that it puts back into the running of its station. Other things like commercial activities, selling audio production services, those sorts of things. Or I think there's one that has a museum, and that's only a small amount of money, but generates some revenue too. So there's certainly commercial things you can do, and stations need to be thinking about those sort of things in the current economic environment. And myth 5, before we move on to reserves, is you can't spend money on administration. And one of the things I would say very strongly is it's really important to consider what you're spending your money on. High administration costs alone don't indicate that a station's is poorly run. It can be a mark of effectiveness. You should invest in your personnel. You should invest in the things you do, the back office things you do, like bookkeepers and those sort of things, so that you have the information and you have a well-managed organisation. So bearing in mind the facts, let's move to talking about reserves in more detail. Reserves play a really important role in the financial sustainability and long-term sustainability of a station. So it's a really important thing for a community radio station to talk about from time to time. And I would suggest on it, at least on an annual basis, if not more regularly, you should be talking about the sort of reserves you're generating. What are reserves? Well, simply they're funds that a station sets aside to cover unexpected or sudden costs. Often, we refer them to as a rainy day fund or a financial cushion. There's some things that aren't what we would call reserves, and certainly for the purpose of today's teleconference webinar, we won't call them reserves, but they're things like buildings, land, or money you have in your accounts that's for a very specific purpose. So why is it important to have reserves? Well, there's a few reasons. It's very important to support a station's financial stability, and reserves play an important role in the management of risk. Reserves can be used in many ways, but 3 are, for example, you may decide to use funds to fund improvements or new projects that will ultimately help your listeners or your volunteers at your station, or essentially the station being on air. And you could, decide years ahead that you need to build a new studio, so you put aside some money every year towards those reserves. You may need to draw on reserves to respond to an unexpected change in financial position. Maybe that's a storm knocks your transmitter over and you need to fund quickly a new transmitter and aren't able to access enough funds from emergency sources such as the Community Broadcasting Foundation's emergency funds for those sort of activities. And a healthy level of reserves is the sign of a well-governed and resilient station. In saying that though, what's a good level of reserves? Because I see it quite often that members will say, oh, you've got $50,000 in the bank, you should be spending it on something to do with the running of the station. Why are you sitting on that money? Clearly I also hear people saying, well, you've only got $10 in the bank and that's not enough, what are you going to do? So it's a really important conversation to have at a committee level to decide what is the appropriate level of reserves. What I will say is that there is no single level that's considered appropriate for all stations. All stations are different and their needs and financial positions are different. So a station, you need to basically assess your own situation and decide an appropriate level of reserves at a particular point in time. One year it might be something, some risks might be coming ahead, or you need to replace your transmitter in 3 or 4 years' time, and you need to start saving for those things. So your plan around reserves becomes greater. I think what's really important though is you have, again, you have this conversation about what's an appropriate level of reserves, and you budget for it. So you are actually saying, well, we're going to need to do this a few years ahead, and we will actually plan for it and put some money away for it. I mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, members ask questions about reserves. So it's really quite important that you explain to the public, the regulators, you know, ACMA might ask questions if you're sitting on lots of money, or if you're got very little in the back about your potential to be sustainable going forward, and explain why you've picked that amount of money to have in the bank. So what should a committee talk about when you're trying to determine your level of reserves? And I think this is certainly not the only things you can talk about, but this is a series of questions that a committee can ask and have a discussion about in determining your level of reserves. What liabilities, current and future, does the station have? Have you borrowed some money? Do you owe some money? What are you going to have to pay for in the future? Have you, you know, is your income's going to go up and you need to put some money aside for something like increased copyright fees? Staff entitlements. If you have staff, what would happen if you suddenly had a crisis and had to retrench your staff? There's legal requirements around paying out annual leave. There's legal requirements about retrenching people and those sorts of things. So consider if that's relevant or not relevant to you. What changes in funding or the political landscape may affect current and future income streams? So if you're reliant on money from your local council, and there's a new council coming in who you don't think are going to be so willing to support you, maybe you need to increase your level of reserves. Likewise, a federal government that's, if you're getting money from the Community Broadcasting Foundation, that's reducing their amount of money. I think, and this is probably topical today, what external events may affect the station service? Natural disasters, for example. Are you in a cyclone-prone area? Are you in a bush fire-prone area? Does that mean you should put aside more money for that rainy day or that cushion if something goes wrong? What compliance issues need to be addressed? You know, did ACMA in your license renewal say you need to make some changes around something and that's going to cost you some money? Those sorts of things you may need to consider. Are there any potential legal claims? I know from time to time there are community radio stations that are being sued or are taking action against something, and there's that need to keep some money aside for if something goes wrong. And then of course I think probably one of the most critical for community radio stations is what's upcoming in terms of repairs or upgrade. Do you need to replace your transmitter next year or in 5 years' time? What about all those computers in the studio, the microphones and those sort of things that you need to put aside? Are you better planning for that ahead of time and putting some money away every year to look after those things? So there's a whole lot of questions to ask yourselves as you're going forward. I know quite a few community radio stations have also developed a reserve policy. It doesn't need to be detailed. It could just be a few paragraphs really, talking about why it's important to have reserves, and that's so your members know what you're doing. When you have an AGM, you can talk about why you have reserves. The CBAA, for example, does that in our annual report. It talks about essentially putting money away for a rainy day and for in this current economic climate, and for things that may go wrong, and also to invest in future activities. A bit of an explanation of how you determine the appropriate level of reserves. It might be a formula, it could just be a list of things you've decided you need to do. I think keeping it simple is probably the key around that. a strategy for building an appropriate level of reserves. Now actually having a policy is the easy bit. I know the hard thing to do in a community radio station is actually make a profit every year so that you can build your reserves. But if you don't have a conversation about it and you don't plan to actually do it, it's very unlikely to actually happen. And then who's responsible within the station for determining and using the reserves? Is it the committee? If you're a bigger station and have staff, what can the staff do in terms of that? You know, normally I would expect a reserves policy is a committee level or a board level issue, and deciding how to access that reserves is part of a station's budgeting process year to year. How reserves identified in accounts and budgets. You know, often on your balance sheet you will just show members' equity. Well, you could have members' equity, you split that into a couple of accounts, members' equity and reserve for new transmitter, for example, and you actually allocate some money across to that, so it's very well identified in your chart of accounts and the reports that you present to members and to the committee at your regular meetings. You know, criteria around when you will spend it. Again, transmitter burns down or blows down, studio has a problem. They're the easy ones. There you're going to have to access to keep yourselves on air. But what other things are there? New projects you'd like to do? You want to save up to run a, you want to save up over a couple of years to get a station manager in, or you want to save up to buy a specific piece of equipment, or those sorts of things. And of course, as I've mentioned, communication is the key. I think in not-for-profits, communication is often a very important thing to do to make sure your members are across what you're doing, your entire committee's across what you're doing, and your other stakeholders are across what you're doing. So in summary, before we move on, I think there's 6 key takeaways from my presentation here. Stations should aim to make a profit. You're not going to make one every year, possibly, but you should certainly aim to make a profit every year. A loss every now and then is okay, but a loss on a regular basis is a real problem. And just don't forget that even if you're only making a 2 or 3% profit, you know, CPI is 2 or 3%, maybe a little bit lower. You should be aiming to make profits above that CPI. So in a real sense, the amount of money you have is a profit. It's not just being, your amount of money you have is not being reduced by inflation. Build reserves to cover unexpected or sudden costs. I think that's one of the most important things you can do. Consider what is an appropriate level of reserve based on your situation. You know, I'm often told you should have 3 months of operating revenue. Some people even tell me 6 months. That might be a bit of a guide, but it's not necessarily relevant to you. But I would suggest that it's probably at least in that range. So what would happen if all your income sources cut off? You would have enough money to run for 3 or 6 months, which gives you a bit of time to try and fix your revenue sources or fix the issues you have. Develop a reserve policy and explain it. I've mentioned that multiple times. And I think really importantly, station committees are collectively responsible for ensuring that a station maintains an appropriate level of reserve. It's not just the treasurer's responsibility, it's the entire committee's responsibility. Legal liability for a station's finances rests with the committee as a whole, not the treasurer. So it's vitally important that everyone on the committee is across a station's financial situation and part of the conversation in planning its annual budget and its reserve policies. Well, that brings my presentation to an end. Emma, I'll hand back over to you for the second part.
Fantastic. We're all quiet on the text box there with regard to questions, so you must have really had everyone deeply engaged. I just have one quick question that might be on other people's minds for you, Jon. Just regarding how you introduce the conversation at your station, whether at a board meeting or we've got a few people here who are on station staff. Just do you have any key pointers on starting that conversation in a way that's going to be productive for you?
Look, I think it's an important conversation to have. Stations operate in different ways. Certainly if you're a station manager, you have some responsibility for ensuring that the station operates, or you have significant responsibility for ensuring that the station operates effectively and is operated responsibly. So, you know, initially having a conversation with the chair and the treasurer and saying, you know, we need to actually factor this planning into our regular agenda at our board meetings is a good way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic advice. We've just got a comment there from Ken Thompson, who has asked if the CBAA has a template policy to kick things off. We certainly do. So I'll write my email in the chat box following the next presentation, and you can get in contact with me if you'd like some more information on that. We've just got one more comment from Geordie saying, I think the word surplus is key in the communication around this topic rather than profit. So a bit of a terminology comment.
Yeah,
yep.
I think I will comment on that. I think it's evolving in the not-for-profit sector that the word profit is not a dirty word. Profit and surplus are one and the same thing and can be used interchangeably. You use the words, though, that best works in your environment. So I don't think it really matters. You know, if I'm talking to my peers in the not-for-profit sector, the word profit is used all the time. In some other organisations, surplus is. So I don't think it really matters. You just use the word. They mean the same thing.
Great, and we've actually just livened up the chat box here. We've got a few more. One question from Ivan: to raise funds, who takes on that role at a station? My initial response would be anyone who has the capacity but also the skill level. I think it's a collaborative effort in my opinion. John?
Look, I think that's who does what is a key responsibility of a committee. You're right, Emma, the person needs to have the skill. It also depends on what your key revenue sources are going to be. You know, there's some stations that function very well on sponsorship, the traditional spot model. Others, I know stations I've visited whose get 90% of their revenue through Bunnings barbecues. So I think, you know, a committee needs to decide how it's going to raise revenue, find something that's most cost effective and get the people with the best skills to do that. I mean, I know I'm not a salesperson. I'm not someone that you would ask to go and sell spots to your local small businesses. So I think it depends on, you know, what you're good at, who you have on in your group that's good at particular things, and you utilise those talents.
Definitely. Tony asks, where is the best place to park accessible reserves?
I'm presuming that question is around bank accounts or those sorts of things. I think certainly not under your bed in cash. Look, I think that's what you need to look at. It depends on if you need it in 2 months' time, then it's pointless putting in a 6-month term deposit. But certainly I think for smaller stations, your obvious options are, you probably, if you should have an operating bank account which has some in it. Surplus money might go into a higher interest account and you may use term deposits from time to time, but it really depends on how much money you have. You know, we have stations that turn over between $5,000 annually and $5 million in this sector. So it really depends on your scale, what's most appropriate for you. But, you know, certainly the CBAA can help with some of those questions on a more direct basis too.
Definitely, we definitely can, and as I said, I'll provide you all with my contact details following this webinar. Just to close out this section of our presentation, Susan has just commented, I think the concept of 3 to 6 months cash reserves at the end of financial year is really important. So thank you for that comment, Susan, and thank you for your time, John.
Thank you, Emma.
So next up we have Larry James, who is President of Golden Days Radio in Victoria, and Larry joins us sorry, I'll just make sure that I have him teed up. Larry joins us, and he is, Golden Days Radio has been around for, he's been with Golden Days Radio for 14 years in various roles, which is quite an achievement, and also has been in the role of president for 7 years. So Larry has kindly agreed to join us as they have delved into this very topic and looked at dispelling the myth that profit is a dirty word throughout their station. I'll just open up your mic there for you, Larry. Just bear with me 1 second. Are you there, Larry? Larry, can you hear me? Actually, you have just noted here that you've self-muted. So if you can see next to your own name, there is a little microphone button, and if it's got a red line across it, you should be able to hear us now if you untick that. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, Creating Cash Reserves. How are you this evening?
I'm well, thank you, Emma, and John there. John's still there too, I guess.
Yes, he is.
So thank you. Yeah, great to be here, and the presentation so far has been terrific.
Wonderful. Yes. We've got getting in some shout outs there from some people down near your station in the chat box, which is fantastic. So just to kick us off, Larry, while you're talking us through your presentation, I'm going to pop up some photos that you've provided us of the station. And we've got one there as Golden Days Radio was the recipient of the Tony Staley Award in the 2016 CBAA Community Radio Awards, which is a fantastic achievement for the station and a great testament to its success over the years. Now, Larry, would you just like to tell us a little bit about Golden Days Radio?
Certainly, Emma. Well, Golden Days Radio started in 1991 in a small little place, actually in a garage in a suburb here called East Bentley. A couple of people got together. They were both returned soldiers people, and they got together because at that time Melbourne radio station 3AK, which used to play beautiful music, they changed their music policy overnight and changed it to Italian, and they lost their entire audience. They never recovered it. So these two people were doing the same sort of thing, and they met up one day and said, look, why don't we get together and start a radio station? So they did. They hired a transmitter, and in those days they had cassette tapes with all the nice music on it. Anyway, that was in the early days, 1991. And then we got approval to broadcast for 2 days a week, sharing it with Monash University, one of the big universities here in Melbourne. And then in 2001 we got our full-time licence 24/7. So we've really been full-time since then, so 16 years going along. We've got 92 volunteers. We don't have any paid staff. So we've got a lot of, because of the type of music that we play, we play music from the 30s to the 70s, and we're called Golden Days Radio for Senior Citizens Incorporated. So we're a seniors radio station, and we play a lot of the old radio serials, Dad and Dave, The Passing Parade, and lots of other ones. So these are very rarely heard around radio these days. So we have a big audience for the 50 plus group. A lot of our audiences are in the 70s, 80s and 90s. We even have a couple in there that are 100. It's amazing.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
Oh, it is. And we also have a lot of people involved that have been in the industry, both in television and radio. And they've helped us enormously. And we have a couple of people who are still in the industry in broadcasting in television that help us out with voiceovers and all sorts of things. So we've got a good team of people, and that's what we're so proud of to have.
And that's definitely what contributes to that success. So can you tell us about, as president, so what is your take on this word profit and why is it so dirty? And when we're talking about this in terms of a radio station's health, what's your take on it?
Well, profit is not a dirty word. I spent 25 years with ANZ in banking, so looking at profit and losses is part of my daily routine, so I'm quite used to the word profit. And we're all, even though we're not-for-profit organisations, we do and we must make a profit. The only difference is that we don't have any shareholders, so we don't actually pay out a dividend. How we should make a profit, which gets ploughed back into the organisation for such things as equipment purchase, new CD players or microphones, payment of rent, music copyright fees, purchase of new music CDs, online bits and pieces. So you've got to keep that going, and you must work at a profit, because if you don't, you're going to go down the gurgler. So the key word there is forward planning, of course, and you must forward plan. You must have an annual budget. We have an annual budget which we look at each year. We work out the figures, and each month we review it at our committee meetings, work out where we're going and what's going well, what's not going so well, and what can we do about it. So we're always reviewing it at least once a month, because otherwise if you don't, you go backwards. So you've got to know your costs. So if people don't know their costs, they've got to get out your previous invoices and just find out what is it costing you to run the station. Now where we are, we have to pay rent, and we pay $31,000 a year in rent, and it's a commercial building. So where we were before, which used to be at the Caulfield Racecourse, we paid nothing. So that was a big learning curve for us about 8-9 years ago, when we had to move our entire operation 2 k's away from Caulfield Racecourse to where we are in Glen Huntly. So that's a big amount which we've got to make sure we've got funds available every month to pay.
And what was the influence? Obviously your background helped develop a sort of cash management system at the station, but was that move the thing that inspired really making sure you had cash reserves, or what was the sort of catalyst in creating this system around your cash reserves?
Well, we've always had, since pretty well day one, the idea that we should have 1 year's operating costs available if something happens, like the GFC came a few years ago. If something catastrophic happens, how are we going to pay our commitments to various organisations? So our sort of philosophy has been to maintain 12 months revenue in reserves, and we put them in term deposits. It's in banks. And one of the things we use is, and I believe they're all over Australia, the Bendigo Bank, the community banks.
Yes.
We use them, and we put everything in term deposits, and quite a lot of the time we just keep rolling it over, so you get compound interest on that. And whilst interest rates aren't the greatest at the moment, perhaps 2.5 to 3.5% if you're lucky, hopefully over time they might increase a little bit. But the Bendigo Bank's been very good to us, because we've been able to get a number of grants from them to do various things, and they're one of our major sponsors. So and one of the in fact the chairman of that bank is on our development fund. So they're very entwined with us, and they support us, as well as all the cricket clubs and soccer clubs and softball clubs and all of that. We're in there as well. So that's one of the things we do, is we support them, they support us.
And it really comes back to that topic that we just talked about before, of skills in the station. What sort of skills are you people? What kind of people are you attracting with specific skills in this area to help implement these systems?
Yeah, well, we've got a couple of people that worked in banking. We've got another person that worked in the Coles Mire area, fairly high up. We've got a lot of people that worked in in businesses in importing and exporting, so they know that you're importing goods, you've got to pay for them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're using all our lifetime skills to keep the radio station running at a profit, and we've never had a loss yet, so we're lucky. But I mean, we look at it, we make sure that we don't go in the red, because that's not our object. We want to keep going forward, because we want to. Who knows what's around the corner? Whether we might have to buy a new transmitter, all those sorts of things. We've had equipment breaks down. You can go and buy a new one. We bought a broadcast panel from a community station up in northern New South Wales a few months ago, which they had on for sale. We bought it, so it's a spare one for our engineering people to test equipment. All those things keep us on the air, and having money in the bank just tells us that we've got to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And so if things do get to a point when they maybe are looking close to the red, is there sort of a bit of an action plan in place at the station that the board says, right, we've got these 5 things, or we've got a number of things that we know we need to do to reverse this situation? Is there a go-to?
Well, there might be, if the income is not going as well as it should be, we've got to say, well, what have we committed for this year? And we might say, look, okay, the ABC of microphones might have to be put back on the back burner for another 12 months because we can't afford that, whatever it might be. And we've got to realise that what do we need to pay first? Some of these luxury items, okay, well, that would be nice, but we can't afford that this year. Let's have a look at it next year. And we just keep it on the side there. And as our funds increase, we say, well, okay, we've got funds available now to buy that, and we can do it. So it's basically just looking at your accounts each month, and we put it on an Excel spreadsheet with our income and expenditure in the various categories, and we review them all. Each month we review all the payments. They all get approved, so everybody on the committee knows what we're paying for. We purchase a lot of radio programs from Grace Gibson Productions, for instance, so we know how much we're going to spend on that each month, and that's a very important part of our programming. So we would never not pay for those, because our listeners would say, "Where's the episode?"
It sounds like you've got a very loyal listenership, which is really great. So yeah, which is fantastic, and I have listened to those shows. They are very good.
Yeah.
So Larry,
can I just mention?
Yeah, you can.
I'm just going to mention one thing. I don't know whether any of the other people listening in have considered ROCO, which is the Register of Cultural Organisations. And that's where you get approved for tax deductibility on donations of $2 and over. We did that 4 or 5 years ago. So we're registered for donations, and it's specific donations. We call it the Golden Days Radio Development Fund. So you can't use it for memberships, and you can't use it for paying your power bill or whatever. But things like if you've got to buy a new transmitter, people who donate to this fund, they get an approved tax deductibility receipt, and it stays in this particular account, which again is on a term deposit. And that's all going to be approved by the Register of Cultural Organisations in Canberra. So if anybody wants to follow that up, and I recommend you do because it's fantastic, the website is arts.gov.au, and we've been very successful in that. The last 4 or 5 years, we've had quite a few people donating, not just $10 or $100, but multiple thousands. So it's so well worth having a look at.
Fantastic. I've just popped the link there in the chat box for everybody. My question to you, which is I also posed to Jon, because around educating other people on your board or at station management level about what cash reserves actually are, because I think that really helps with everyone getting on board and really understanding what the station's trying to achieve with that and dispel those myths. In this process, did you have to provide any education or further information to any of your station members who were involved in the process about the benefit to the sustainability of the station of having healthy cash reserves?
I think the majority of people on our committee of management have been in business for many years, so they understand profit and loss and assets and non-assets and all of that. But over the years, there's been 3 or 4 people that perhaps haven't come from that background, that perhaps might have been out working on building sites or whatever, just to pick up an industry, that don't understand all that. So we just simply sit them down and show them what it all means, because a lot of people perhaps haven't seen a balance sheet. What's a profit, what's an asset, what's a non-tangible asset, what's a liability, current and deferred and all of that. And we just go through and we show them the balance sheet of what we've done over the last few years. And then at each committee meeting we go through all of this and we say, well, look, here's our monthly income, this is what we're going to spend, this is what we've got left in the bank. And these are the bills we've got to pay this month. So it's a bit of a learning curve for some of them, but they've all understood it. But you've just got to be patient, because some people haven't had the benefits that I have had being in banking, and you've just got to help them along. And it's worked out pretty well for us.
Yep. Definitely. I think that's a really important point in having the time to sit new board members down. And we do talk to some of our stations about, well, do you have a board induction policy and procedure, and what elements does that include? Because sometimes it doesn't include the financial management side of things, which is everyone's responsibility on the board at the end of the day. So it's really important that they're across what that is. So thank you for that advice. I've just got a question here from Phil, and he asks, what do you do to raise funds for Golden Days Radio?
Well, we've done a few things. When we had to move from Caulfield Racecourse to where we are now, we didn't have enough money to make the move, and it cost us about $400,000 to build 3 new studios and put in air conditioning and all the bits and pieces. So what we did is we came up with a pledge system where people donated $100, $250, $500, $1,000 and $10,000, and we actually sent out. They got a nice pledge form. We raised $80,000 doing that, and at the end of that, we actually held a function at the branch at the studios with drinks and nibbles and things like that to thank all these people for donating. And we had 2 or 3 people that gave us $10,000 each. Not only listeners, but some of our sponsors and some of notable people in Melbourne who listened to Golden Days and wanted it to continue. So that was one thing we did. Other things we do is we have studio tours, for instance, where we ask for a gold coin donation. We do audio production facilities, and we just did one for the local one of the community groups there who wanted some voice recorded for a walking tour. And if you've been into some of the museums overseas, you pick up a little recorder and you put it to your ear and you press the button and it tells you what you're looking at. Well, we did that for the local community in Glen Ira for walking tours around all the streets. So we got some money out of that. We also have a lot of members, so members pay their membership fees, and most members round it up to the nearest $100. We get lots of donations, sponsorship revenue obviously, and bequests. People forget bequests. Have you got a bequests brochure? Because that has been very profitable for us as well. And we have a plaque on the wall where we put those people's names on the wall so people can see if their loved ones come in, they can see that the name on the wall, and that goes into consolidated revenue again on term deposits, and it's there for a rainy day if we need it.
And creates that everlasting relationship with the station as well. And you just took the words out of Laurie's mouth, because they just asked about UberQuest 2. If anyone has any other questions, I encourage you to pop them down in the chat box as well. But was there anything else that you'd like to mention? Larry, I suppose one more question for you that came through in the private chat there was just an approximate level of healthy cash reserves for the station, what you look at in that bracket.
Well, we look at around $200,000 for an annual budget. So if the world crashed in tomorrow and we couldn't pay our bills, we would have, say, about 200,000 operating funds available to pay the power bill, the rent, and all the other bits and pieces, APRA fees, and telephone, all those things, postage, maintenance, and things like that. So we work on about 200,000, but we work on a year. So some people are saying 3 and 6 months. Well, that's good, but we've worked on a year for many years, and that's worked quite well. The other thing just like mention is that we've all got sponsors, and at Golden Days we have some terrific sponsors. In fact, we just had a luncheon at our studios today. We do this about 3 times a year for people who have helped Golden Days with maybe sponsors, could be a retired presenter or a volunteer who's done a great amount of work. We have about 12 around the table, and we have one of our committee people does all the catering, and we bring them in to basically thank them. And one person there today was our longest serving sponsor. He'd been there since day one, and he's still with us and thinks we're wonderful. So those little things help. And the other thing we do is once a year we get all the sponsors in, those that are able to, invite them in for a drink just before Christmas, have some drinks and nibbles, and get them to meet everybody who runs the station. That works very, very well for us, and they see where we're coming from, and we see their products. And one of our sponsors is a Honda dealer. Now, they've been with us for probably 15 or so years, and I've got to say there's probably about 7 or 8 of us at the station that have bought Hondas from this particular dealer. And I got my car serviced there yesterday, and they're also switched on. And they see us supporting them, they support us. So all those little things help, and we're just lucky to have a lot of the sponsors with us, because without them it would be very hard to operate.
I love those ideas, and I'm definitely going to pick your brains for the CBAA resource library. And I feel the most important point of that is that they're not cost-heavy ideas to show people that will continue their support, that to show people how much you appreciate them. You can just, you can achieve it, and it goes a long way for the station. Tony's just commented in the chat box, I would suggest that an important part of reserves is equipment redundancy policy. In our case, we have double and triple redundancy on things like antennas, transmitter cables, computer mixers, and most other things in the transmission and operational chain. I feel like that's definitely a really important point, because without your transmitter, where are you?
Yep, your practice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So would you like to say anything else in closing, Larry?
Well, I think I've got here, I've just talked about term deposits. I think I've covered all the notes I've written here. But the main thing is that you've got to do forward planning, know what your costs are, and sit down and if you don't know what your costs are, go through your payments book and find out what you've paid over the last 12 months and just see what your regular fees are. You know you're going to have power on a monthly basis, you'll have APRA fees, you'll have equipment purchases and perhaps insurance, liability insurance for defamation. That's also important. We do that as well. So that's a big thing. And production fees, making programs, buying programs, all that sort of thing. So there's a a lot of things to do, but the first thing is to sit down and work out what you've paid, say, over the last 12 months if you're starting from scratch, and just work out a bit of a picture, and then you can work out a budget and see how you go from there.
And just finally, scraping in at the end, Susan has just asked an important that probably is on a lot of people's lips, is building a reserve of 200K is, whilst paying bills, is very impressive. She asks, how long did it take to build up that reserve?
Well, that reserves, that's the minimum. I mean, we've been lucky because we've put a lot more away over the years. So because we don't have any paid staff, we're all volunteers, so we don't have any wages, we don't have any long service leave and all the other bits and pieces that you've got to do. If we were paying staff, then it would be a totally different picture. Mm-hmm. But we've got people coming right through that want to volunteer their services. We built up the reserves probably, probably before I even got there. You know, I've been there 13 to 14 years or so. So it was there then, and we continue building on it, and we just keep it in our term deposits. And when we need to use it for whatever purpose, then we can go out and buy it. And, you know, possibility of getting a new transmitter. Well, that's going to be quite a few dollars.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen? And whip aerials and STL links and all these sorts of things. They're not cheap.
That's exactly right. Chris asks, would the reserves be derived from directly from a business plan for the station, or is there a reserve policy in place?
Well, we do have a business plan, but the reserve policy is basically to have a minimum of 1 year's operating revenue. Now we've gone well past that, so we've exceeded our minimum requirement. So and we just keep doing that, and we just bump it all on a term deposit, just get a bit of interest, and then roll it over basically when it falls due, and then plough the interest back on and get compound interest on it. So we just keep doing that, and we think that's worked very well for us, and we're fairly conservative, I guess. That we're all concerned that if the heavens fell in tomorrow or whatever, you know, what are we going to do? But we've got a big buffer, and that's the key word: having a buffer between your costs and your revenue. And we've got a lot of members, so the membership brings in a lot of revenue each year, and they also bring in a lot of half our membership revenue could be put to donations. So a lot of people donate us as well as records and all sorts of things. So we've got a very loyal listening audience that help us. So we're very thankful for all those people that help us, because there's so many people out there that try and do the right thing, and in the industry, it's just fantastic. So we're very lucky.
And we thank you as well, because Golden Days has taught us a lot through this webinar and supported the sector as well. So thank you very much for joining us on this CBAA webinar this evening, Larry. We greatly appreciate it, and good luck with everything in the future at Golden Days.
Thank you very much, Emma. When you're down in Melbourne, you'll have to come and pay a visit.
Oh, I'd love to. I'm just going to throw it in here that I tried to find, and this is for our attendees, the video that Golden Days Radio produced. I'm not quite sure when did you produce that promotional video? I absolutely love it.
Done last year. It's on our website. So if you goldendaysradio.com and click on latest news, it's the second item. There's a photograph of one of our ladies. So if you click on latest news, the first part is talking about one of our station manager got an OAM this year. Yeah. The next item down is the video.
Fantastic. I encourage everybody to get onto the Golden Days website and have a look at that, because it provided us with a lot of joy in the CBAA office when we first learnt about that video. It's really heartwarming, and it's great production.
Oh, it's fantastic. That was done by one of our presenters who had worked in documentary production with SBS. So he did all that for free.
Oh, wonderful.
we had to pay a cameraman, but that was okay. And he's a friend of Golden Days now. So, but can I just say to anybody who's listening in, if you're coming over to Melbourne and you want to come and say hello, just send us an email, martin@goldendaysradio.com, and I'll be happy to show you around anytime.
That's a very kind offer. Thank you very much, Larry, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Emma. Bye-bye.
Well, that wraps up our webinar for this evening, everybody. I hope you learned a lot out of the webinar, and thank you very much for attending. I've just popped 2 links in the chat box there relating, linking back to our resource library, where we will host this webinar in the next couple of days, but we also continually update with resources regarding financial management, cash reserves, this very topic, and amongst other things. So please visit the CBAA website and the resource library to get information on that. As I say, we are wrapping up, and just to touch on the learning outcomes that we presented at the start of this webinar, we learned how effective cash reserve management system can build a stronger future for your station, and those real life examples from Golden Days Radio were fantastic to speak to that point. Through Jon's presentation, dispelled some myths around negative consequences of making a profit, understood what cash reserves are and how much your station should have. That one's a bit quite station dependent, because I think it depends, we recognise that every station is unique, but if you do want some more information on guiding that within your station, we can certainly help you at the CBAA, and understand how to implement a cash reserve system, management system at your station through those real life examples from Larry at Golden Days Radio. And once more, definitely get on their website, because that video is a true heart warmer. It's really wonderful. Well, that's nearly a wrap. That's all from us at the CBAA. Just a plug for our next webinar, CBAA Awards, Put Your Station in the Running for National Recognition. As I mentioned previous, Golden Days Radio was the recipient of the Tony Staley Award in 2016, which is one of our high-hitting awards that recognises a station in the sector that has done incredible work and really is guided by the community broadcasting principles. So fantastic for Golden Days Radio to celebrate that award with their station. When I close off this webinar, there is an evaluation that I would love for everyone to participate in, because it really helps us guide what topics we choose for upcoming webinars, whether we're hitting the mark, whether we could improve in certain areas, and also encourage us with a bit of feedback. If you think that this has been everything that you want it to be, which is wonderful. So thank you very much for joining us once again, and we'll catch you on April 26th for our CBAA Awards webinar. Have a lovely evening.